one.
Okay, let me see if I can get it. Well, let me introduce myself first. As my name on the screen suggests, I'm John Germann, down in Houston, Texas. Um, and I've been a USCS member, I think, Steve, I think it's around 43 years now. Um, long time, longer than I would really want to admit. My main interest in ship covers, I've started off and still pursuing, trying to get as many uh, postmarks from as many different ships, U.S. Navy ships, over the years. So it's it's not a really valuable collection, but it's a very large one. And recently, I've started playing around with World War II censor covers, sailor mail. But those are my two main interests. And I'm a history nut, and I recently got interested in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which is just an absolute mess. And that's one of the things that attracted me about it. And so I thought I would start collecting some of the postal history of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And I ran into the fact that they had ship covers. And so I immediately gravitated, as you might well imagine, towards that area. It's not a well-known area on this side of the world. It's well known, in Europe, but certainly not over here. So I thought I would just share a few things about it, and I hope it's worth your while. So, okay. So let me see. Are we ready to try to share here, Steve?
Yes, sir.
Okay, let me see. Is that okay? Can y'all see that?
Yep.
How's that?
Looks good from here.
Okay, we're good? Okay, wonderful. So, um, most when I mention to some philatelic friends that when they ask me what I collect, and I say Austrian naval covers, and some of them look at me rather quizzically, uh, because my guess is that the vast majority of people today don't even realize that Austria ever had a navy. And but oh, absolutely they did. And in going into World War One, Austria had the seventh largest navy in the world going into World War One. So the reason why we don't think it has a navy today is because it doesn't. It hasn't had a navy for over 100 years, and this is what it looks like today, completely landlocked. Maybe it could use some gunboats on the Danube, I guess, or something. But as far as being a major naval power, there is no reason for it to be that. And it's been this way since the end of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, since 1918. But prior to that, it was much, much larger. The Austrian Empire was created in 1804 when the Holy Roman Emperor uh, just sort of shelved the Holy Roman Empire. And we okay? Just sort of put the Holy Roman Empire to rest and renamed it the Austrian Empire. He was a Habsburg. And this is what the Austrian Empire looked like in 1850. And you can see there it's got Croatia and Austria itself and Hungary, Serbia. This is Transylvania, Galicia. This is what they call Czechia. Today it's got known by a lot of names. This is its coat of arms up here. And so it was fairly substantial in size in 1850. But it lost in the 1860s, it lost two consecutive major wars, one to Italy, one to Prussia, both of which were, relatively new on the scene. And it lost territory. It certainly lost prestige. It was, and at the same time that it was losing all of that, for the first time ever in history, and on the right is what's going to be the Austro-Hungarian Empire. For the first time ever in history, there was a united Germany in 1870. It had been nothing, for ages, A lot of German people, of course, but they were living in provinces like Hesse and Saxony and Prussia and so on. Never, ever been in Germany. And there hadn't been a united Italy for a long, long time. As philatelists, we would know about the Papal States and the two Sicilies and Sardinia, etc. And then in 1870 to 71, both of these countries became united, and they are both on the Austrian border. So it had suffered two very embarrassing defeats. It is now, bordered by two up and coming world powers. So to try to reinvent itself and become once again a major player, in 1867, the Austria Empire united with Hungary and becomes the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And it will last as such as it is, all the way to the end of the war. So it lasts about 50 years all told, from 1867 to 1918. It's an absolute monstrosity. This is it here, and you can see how it covers all kinds of territory. I think they issued postal cards in something like 10 different languages because it was so diverse, very difficult to hold together. In Austria and Hungary, the two main, cores of the empire, were radically different. They spoke different languages. They had a different culture. They were really, really not very similar. And it's sort of a very shaky relationship. I mean, there were three armies. There was a united Austro-Hungarian army, and then there was a separate Austrian army and a separate Hungarian army. There were separate parliaments. So it's really a fairly weak empire from the very beginning. But it was Austria's attempt, to try to get back on the scene in a big, big way. So from that point on, whenever you see postmarks and stamps from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, they are labeled KUK, and that's German, but it could also easily be English. It's German for Kaiser und Königlich, Kaiser and King, or in English. So it's German, but it means like you've got an empire in Austria and you've got a kingdom, entirely different type of government in Hungary. But they are, at least on the surface, trying to work together over this 50-year period. It did have, let me go back, it did have, as you can see here, a coastline, largely Croatian. It lost territory, it lost this coastline. This was what was known as Lombardy Venetia. Again, they issued stamps for this. This had belonged to Italy, and it was taken back by Italy, so you don't see it over here, okay? But it still had a good coastline. It lost this coastline here, but all of this is why it has a navy. This is the Adriatic Sea here, and these five this is Fiume. And these three were not only the really big naval bases, they also had shipbuilding facilities. Here's a major naval base at Zara, Z-A-R-A, and here's one all the way down in this is today Croatia. This is all the way down in what is today Montenegro. This is the naval base at Cattaro. Now they had ports along the way, for smaller ships, coastal ships, submarines, things of this sort. But these five are the really big naval bases. Okay. This is the ensign, the flag that they flew on the mast. If you took this out of the picture, you would have the Austrian flag today. It is basically two red bars surrounding a white bar. That is the flag right here. This represents Austria, the Empire of Austria. This is the crown of Saint Stephen, which is the symbol for the Kingdom of Hungary. as I said, it had this going into World War I in 1914. It had the seventh largest navy in the world. What were the others? Well, let's look at them by size. You could probably guess what the largest navy was, because without England, without the navy, there would be no England. The largest by far. England had a policy of trying to have a navy uh, equal in size to the next two largest navies put together. It wasn't always able to do it, but it's an island, and its main defense, as Napoleon found out and as Hitler found out, was the navy. So it was number one. Secondly, and quite amazingly, was Germany. Germany was only 45 years old, not even that. And it had the second largest navy in the world in 1914. They came on strong. The third was the U.S. Our army was pathetic, but our navy was pretty large, actually, thanks to Teddy Roosevelt. Fourth was France. Fifth was Russia. And sixth was Italy. Um, and then comes Austria, Hungary. If you're interested in what number eight would be, that would be a surprise, perhaps. That the eighth largest was Japan, which had come out of nowhere in the Far East and had only 6 years earlier destroyed the entire Russian Pacific Fleet during the Russian-Japanese War. So it is a navy to be reckoned with, as the Russians well knew. In any case, this is the Austro-Hungarian capital ships. These are the big ships, not the auxiliaries and things of that sort. But these are the capital ships in the Navy going into World War One. They had four dreadnoughts. Now notice they had 9 pre-dreadnoughts. These were ships very much like the first USS Texas and the Oregon, which were built right at the turn of the century. And then the British put out the USS Dreadnought, which just made everything else look like almost like toys. And so that just escalated the arms race, which helped it more than anything else, perhaps, to bring about the war.
How about HMS Dreadnought?
I'm sorry?
You said USS, you meant HMS Dreadnought.
I did. I'm sorry if it's the HMS Dreadnought. Um, and everybody else decided they better, catch up in a hurry. And so the Austro-Hungarians were part of that, and they will build 4 dreadnought battleships. The first Texas and the Oregon were pre-dreadnoughts of ours, but they canned those. The current USS Texas is an actual dreadnought that replaced the earlier one. But they had 4. The last one was actually not commissioned until 1915. So it was, well into the war itself. They had cruisers galore, as you can see, armored, torpedo, protected, scout. The only difference between these two, armored and protected, was that these are the old ones that only had armor around the ammunition magazine and around the engine room. The armored, those were protected. The armored cruisers had that, plus they also put armor along the sides of the ship for protection as well. Lots and lots of torpedo craft. They were heavily into torpedo kind of warfare. You had torpedo cruisers, of course, that's what destroyers then and now do. And then they had high seas torpedo craft. They had coastal torpedo craft, large numbers, of them. At the start of the war, they only had 6 submarines, but they were allies with Germany, and they built some on their own, and Germany lent them a lot of U-boats during the war as well. So these are the warships. And what I thought I'd do is just to run down some pictures of those, some photos of those, and just to show you sort of what they look like. This is SMS Viribus Unitas. This is a dreadnought. This is one of and it was sort of, I think it was the flagship of the Navy. SMS stands, it's like USS and HMS, United States ship, Her Majesty's ship. This is Signer Majest ship, His Majesty, or it could be her as well. They didn't change it if it happened to be named for an empress. But this is SMS, Variabus Unitis, which was the Kaiser Franz Joseph. He was the emperor till almost the very end of the empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And this was his favorite motto. It was sort of strength or force united, talking about the strength of the Austrians and their unity with the Hungarians. Um, so they adopted that and put it as the name of one of the battleships. Remember, that's one of the four. Um, Here's one of the pre-dreadnoughts. This is the SMS Zrínyi. Zrínyi was the name of a Hungarian noble family, famous noble family. So they had both Austrian and Hungarian names to the ships, as you might well imagine. Here's two of their types of cruisers. A lot of the ships, the larger ships, were named after members of the Habsburg family. Kaiser Karl VI. Um, Here's a couple more. Here's the protected and the scout cruisers. This one at the bottom right was a little newer, as you could tell, than most of the others we've been looking at. Um, but a lot of the ships were outdated by the time World War II came along. It is the largest. It is not necessarily. It would have been fun, quote unquote, to see it stack up against the Japanese Navy. I think it had gotten thrashed. But anyway, it's large, but oftentimes the ships are not up to date. Here's one of its destroyers. The postcard identifies it as a torpedo boat, but it's really a destroyer. I mean, it had the torpedoes, but it's not an actual quote unquote torpedo boat. Here are two different kinds of torpedo craft. The high seas, these could handle the big waves. This is the SMS or SMT. Came in, they started off having their own special names, and then they just started identifying them as TB. This is TB1. This is a coastal, as you can see, much smaller. But they put them together. They had over 50 of these at the start of the war. Here's a U-boat. I don't know whether this particular one was built in Austria. My guess is that it was lent by the Germans. The Austrians speak German, so the U means the same here as it did in Germany. Untersee, underwater boat. They had a lot of this. Is number 40, so they eventually had a lot. They didn't make much of an impact on the war, however. Now, what I thought I would do now is to go through some covers, some postal history, and we'll go. We went on the ships. We went from the biggest to the smallest. Here I'll go from the smaller ones to the larger ones. Just a sampling to show you the kinds of covers and the kinds of postmarks that the Austro-Hungarian Navy produced. So we'll start with this one. This is the SMS Schwarzenberg. A torpedo storage ship. Didn't start that way, but that's the way it wound up. You can see that it was originally a sailing ship, by and large, with an auxiliary funnel here. Commissioned in 1880, so it goes back a pretty good ways. As the Loudon, it was renamed in 1900, served as a training ship. Was common in the States as well, and then became a stationary torpedo storage ship. Stationary meaning they took the engine out of it. Here it is being scrapped over here in 1923, and the name is still on the stern here. So as far as the cover is concerned, this is not real common. This is a straight line, SMS Schwarzenberg. It's a registered cover. It's post-free, as was true in almost all countries, sailors for regular mail had free postage, and that was true. That was true here. It is mailed from Šibenik, and Šibenik is in today's Croatia. It's one of those smaller ports that would house maybe submarines or torpedo craft, and therefore um, could use a storage ship. You'll read about a lot of torpedo storage ships because they had all kinds of torpedo craft. That was just one of their emphases. So anyway, that's a what's the date on this? I'm trying to think when this one is. Um, this is 1916 during the war, and it was Topola, Pola, the biggest naval base um, for the Austro-Hungarians. Now here's a field post, meaning the same thing as it does today in Europe, and it's like APOs, FPOs. It's military. I'm very fond of this cancel. It's one of my favorites. Instead of saying SMS Vulcan, it's SM Hulk Vulcan because they had taken the engine out of it. It was an ironclad, originally named the Prince Eugen in 1878, and this is what it looked like long before. It was renamed and converted once again to a stationary, engineless repair ship in 1909. They towed it to Šibenik, and it served the entirety of World War I there. And you can see the Šibenico cancel here in the corner. That's Italian, because it's right, across from Italy. There are a lot of Italians who live there. So Šibenik or Šibenico is really the same thing. So um, it's a just an interesting cover. I just love the Hulk. Here's a postcard. If this looks like an ocean liner, that's because originally it was. It was built in Germany in 1878 as the ocean liner Fürst Bismarck, in other words, Prince Bismarck. In 1909, the Russians purchased it. And then in 1909, the Austro-Hungarians repurchased it, renamed it, and converted it once again to a torpedo storage ship. But that's one heck of a large storage ship. So eventually it became a houseboat for submariners. And this postcard image shows it tied up to several Austro-Hungarian submarines and probably in Sabenico or somewhere. It did survive the war. He made one post-war trip to the U.S. as an Italian liner. The Italians got a hold of it at war's end, put it back together as an ocean liner, and it just made it took over 2,300 people across the Atlantic to the United States shortly after the war. But I think it's scrapped not long after the war. Interesting if you collect naval, U.S. ships and you're into classics, you would realize that the vast majority of early um, cancels of U.S. ships are on postcards, picture postcards. And that is not quite as true overseas, but it's largely the same. And that's true here. You'll see a lot of these early ones, the World War I vintage ones, that were on picture postcards. It was called the SMS Ga, which is she was a mythological figure, a princess or goddess, excuse me, of some sort. Here's a little small gunboat, the SMS Meteor. It looked like it might have trouble on the high seas. And during World War I, it escorted and patrolled out of Pola. It's just sort of a patrol ship. It really never went very far, but that's what it looked like. And it's a pretty nice cancel for that little ship. Here's another, this is a coastal defense ship. Again, not destined for anything on the high seas. It has, it's sort of a straight line. Maybe there's such a thing as a curved line postmark. It's but His Majesty's ship Budapest, um, built it, commissioned in 1898, did some training ops and did engage in some um, action, bombarded several towns, probably in Italy or Albania, but it was converted into a barrack ship in 1918. So a lot of these, were no longer military vessels by the time that the war ended. Um, this is a torpedo boat. You can see it, SM torpedo boat 19. I don't have a photo, couldn't find a photo of the 19, but this is TB-22, a sister ship, so it would have looked pretty much like this. Again, postcard sent to Vienna. It was commissioned all the way back in 1891, which would make it, well over 20 years old by the time the war arrived. It did work along the coast of the Adriatic, for example, Albania on the Austrian side of the Adriatic. It is censored. A lot of the censors had where they were censored at. This is just a straight line censored auxiliary mark. This is an unusual one. This is the SMS Hussar, the second. The first one ran aground off of Trieste in 1908 and sank. So they hurriedly produced another one. And this is it over here to the left. This is a sort of a strange, it was never mailed. My guess is it might have been a favor cancel. It's the most unusual cancel because this looks very, very much like a civilian postmark. And you see Hussar at the very bottom. Those are really uncommon. And it didn't, like I said, it didn't see postal usage. This is on the front and there's absolutely nothing on the reverse. But this one was commissioned in 1910, so it's not quite that old. It was involved variously in the Adriatic. The Albania being sort of Italian, of course, at the time. So here's the SMS Kaiserin und Königin Maria Theresia. It's quite a name. This is for Maria Theresa, as we would call her, an earlier empress. And so the feminine for Kaiser is Kaiserin, and the feminine for Könige, king, is Königin. What's amazing to me, and this is, I think, my favorite naval council, is how they managed to get all of that in to one small cancel. KUK, Kriegsmarine. Here's Kaiserin, Königin. Here's Maria Theresia. Here's the the date, and they managed to get it all in there. So this one is censored with a looked over, überprüft. This is was a military censor, and he was at Zara, one of those big bases on the Adriatic. It was commissioned in 1894. It did some world cruising to the Caribbean and to China, but during the war, it was just a harbor guard, and then ultimately, like so many others, they either turn them into torpedo storage ships or barrack ships or repair ships. And moving up the line, here's one of the pre-dreadnoughts, the SMS Erzherzog, that means Archduke Karl. This one is commissioned in 1906. It was still active. It attacked the biggest engagement that the fleet had was bombardments of Ancona in Italy. There was also a major mutiny. It didn't last for very long, but just in terms of number of sailors, there was a major mutiny in the Navy at Cattaro down there at Montenegro. The sailors, the common sailor, the food was terrible. The officers were insolent and looked down on them and treated them very, very poorly. They were seeing no action. They were just parked there doing nothing. So they got bored. And so eventually right towards the end of the war. They mutinied, but it was put down in just a few days. But it was not a small thing at all from Austro-Hungarian's point of view. And then to the top of the line, this is the SMS Tegethoff, a dreadnought, one of the four. We've seen the Variabus Unitas. Here's one of the others, commissioned, right before the war, built in the country. It also bombarded at Ancona. Well, the Italians got a hold of it at the end of the war too. They toured it around Italy as sort of a trophy. We did the same thing with a captured U-boat, I remember. And they put it into a movie. But it was scrapped before very long. This is sent to a little community in Moravia. Again, a picture postcard, but the SMF Schiff Tegethoff, again in 1916 during the war. So now, the fundamental question, what did this big Austro-Hungarian Navy do in the Great War? And of course, they called it the Great War because they weren't going to call it World War I at that point in time. It was known to them as the Great War. Well, what did it do? Well, the answer, sadly, is basically nothing. And that's one of the reasons that few people have heard about it, I suppose. And the reason is the Allies. The Allies kept it from doing very much. And how did they manage to do that? Well, very interesting. This is Europe during World War I. And the orange are the Central Powers, the Ottoman Empire, Bulgaria, Austria-Hungary, and Germany. The only two that had navies of any consequence were these two here. And both of them their fleets had a problem. And the problem is their access to the rest of the world. Germany, the Navy has to be along the coast. And Germany's coastline is here. It stops abruptly with Denmark. Denmark is a pain as far as Germany is concerned. And then it picks back up here. Well, the German High Fleet, if it's here, it's got to make its way through these narrow straits out here. If it's here, the only way it can get out into the Atlantic, into the high seas and the rest of the world, is either through the English Channel, which is not terribly comfortable during World War I because it's bordered both sides by the enemy, or through the North Sea between the UK and Norway here. Otherwise, it's locked in. The same thing is true for the Austro-Hungarians. This is their coastline. This is where their fleet is. But to get out into the Mediterranean and then perhaps out into the Atlantic, it's got to go through the Strait of Otranto between the heel of Italy and Albania. And you may be able to guess, most likely you can guess what the Allies did. They created, ultimately, not right away, but they created the North Sea and the Dover barrages. This is the North Sea barrage here. Here's the Dover barrage here. They didn't come up immediately. In fact, they didn't come along until 1918. But, the German High Fleet was never a real threat. It got out early in the war, just a few ships, but the only time the High Fleet actually engaged the British fleet, there was one occasion during the entire war where the two actually engaged in battle, and that was at the Battle of Jutland, right alongside Denmark. The one time contest between the two, technically, on paper, it was a draw, but technically it was a British victory because the German fleet returned to its bases and never came out again. The ships that got out that occasioned these barrages were the U-boats. And the Germans relied increasingly on the U-boat. They were the country in the world, the Navy in the world, that had really pursued U-boats. The United States and the UK and France had not. And stopping the submarines was extremely difficult. And these barrages were set up to try to keep the German U-boats from getting out into the open sea, where they were really, they were very, very destructive of the British and the French merchant marine, and ultimately, of course, of the U.S. Merchant marine and navy as well. So, the Allies really didn't play fair. They blocked them off. The number of mines here, I've seen figures that say, and I think they're accurate, that they were largely laid by U.S. mine layers. The British did not have the capacity to do that in the middle of that dog-eat-dog war with the Germans. They put down over 70,000 mines were placed here to here. I mean, there were still gaps and so on, but the number I've seen is 70,177 mines were laid across here with some netting as well to try to ensnare submarines. There were patrol ships behind it, but not many capital ships. The capital ships were needed elsewhere. But that in here, they also put mines and nets as well to block them in. So these barrages were absolutely integral to the Allied naval battle against Germany. You could probably guess what they did to the Austro-Hungarian Navy. Yep, they put another barrage across this right here. Nowhere near as solid, nowhere near as substantial, but it had netting, it had mines, it had more ships, like 200 ships in the area, but a lot of them were small. A bunch of them were what they called drifters, which were basically fishing trawlers that had depth charges on them, things of this sort, who patrolled around hoping to see a submarine and do some damage to it. The Austrian submarines did get through, but the surface fleet did not. And so the surface fleet for Austria was just basically, the Italian coast and Albania. That's where their action was pretty much limited to. So it never did much. So you may know this if you're a collector of classic U.S. Navy cancels. At the end of the war, it took about a half a year to clear all this North Sea mine barrage out. And the United States sent 42 minesweepers or vessels converted to temporary minesweepers over here. And it took them about 6 months to get rid of all these mines in here. What they did is they anchored them on cords, on cables, to the bottom of the sea, and the mines were pretty deep to try to make contact with submarines trying to get through underneath all of this stuff. And so what the U.S. ships did, they're the ones that laid them by and large, and they're the ones that have to remove them by and large. So they cut the cable down below the mine, and then when the mine floated up, bobbed up to the top of the water, they detonated them with gunfire. But it took an awful, awful long time. The barrage here, the Austrians, very, very frustrated with it, attacked it on like 24 different occasions to try to get through, and they never managed to do so. And then in June of 1918, they made one last desperate attempt. They got all 4 of their dreadnoughts and a lot of the rest of their navy, and made an all-out attempted assault to get through that Otranto barrage. didn't work. On their way down to the barrage, one of the latest dreadnought, the SMS St. Istvan, was sunk by an Italian torpedo vessel well before they got to the barrage. And when it went down, everybody, the entire fleet turned around and went back. So the barrage was really never broken. And that was June. In November, the Austrians sued for peace. They created an armistice or signed an armistice. This is a picture, a photo of the St. Istvan. It was sort of the pride. It was the very newest of the dreadnoughts. It stands for St. Stephen, the patron saint of Hungary. And this is what it looked like. This is obviously a before picture. This is the little Italian torpedo boat that sank it. It went down in 3 hours, 2 torpedoes, 3 hours, 39 crewmen killed. But it was such a shock that the Austrian admiral turned the entire fleet around and went back home. So the armistice was on November the 3rd, 1918. The fighting is done. The treaty, of course, is yet to come. But that was the end of Austria-Hungary and the end of the Austrian Navy. After that David and Goliath incident in the Adriatic Sea with the little Italian torpedo boat, the Austrian Navy was finished, and the ships that survived the war, the Austrian ships that did survive the war, were allocated. They were allocated to the Allies, sort of like war prizes. The United States didn't want any. We had more ships than we knew what to do with. A lot of the Austrian ships, of course, were old anyway. And so the United States took none of them. We were Johnny-come-latelys in the war anyway. We had not suffered anywhere near the losses that the British and the French and the Italians had. So we didn't get any. A lot of them, of course, went to France and England, but they didn't really want them either. And almost all of those were very quickly scrapped. They could use the metal, but not the warships. The 2 allies that got the most were Italy, which is, of course, right across the Adriatic, right next door to Austria. It got a bunch, but it didn't use them for very long. Again, its navy didn't really need many of them. The other one, which we hadn't really mentioned, it was a combination of various Slavic groups that at the end of the war will be united for the very first time ever into something called Yugoslavia. And they had the Slovenes, and the Croats, and that group, the Serbians, had no navy at all. So they took them quite willingly and used them in effect for much longer period of time. The Republic of Austria was proclaimed on November the 12th. The armistice was November the 3rd. The Republic, to replace the Habsburg Empire, was declared on November the 12th. That ended. It's really incredible, but that ended 645 consecutive years of Habsburg rule in Europe. It was one of the 4 dynasties that World War I terminated. It was the longest of the bunch, but the others went back a long, long ways too. The Ottoman Empire in Turkey, gone. The Romanov dynasty in Russia, gone during the war. And the Hohenzollern family in Prussia, who took over Germany, the Hohenzollern, the Kaiser and his family, gone. So the Great War was great, not only in terms of the amount of time and awfulness that it produced, but also in terms of the political effects. And so after 645 years, Habsburg rule in Austria ended. And this presentation, which may seem to have lasted equally as long, has also come to an end. Okay. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, John. That was very
Thank
good.
you, John. That was actually very excellent.